Welcome to This View of Life, where we take a deep dive with the best and brightest thinkers on anything and everything from an evolutionary perspective. I am your host, David Sloan Wilson. For more interviews, articles, videos, and special publications, search for This View of Life on your favorite search engine. Hello, this is David Sloan Wilson for This View of Life, the podcast. And I'm so happy to be talking with Joan Silk, a pre-eminent behavioral ecologist and primatologist at the School of Human Evolution and Social Change at Arizona State University. Hello, Joan.
Hi, David.
We go back a long way, and we spent a number of years overlapping at the UC Davis way back in the 1970s, a time that I remember very fondly.
Absolutely.
And I'm motivated to talk with you today for a couple of reasons. The informal subject of this conversation is evolution does not make everything nice. And I'm motivated in part because many sectors of society, including expert policy sectors, still there's a widespread belief that nature left to itself on its own strike some kind of harmonious balance, a kind of a balance of nature worldview, which I think ultimately traces to a pre-Darwinian worldview, a Christian worldview of harmony at all scales, from the smallest insect to the heavens. And we know that's not true, but I think it really needs to be emphasized that evolution doesn't make everything nice. It's not as if niceness never evolves, but it does require special circumstances. And you, with your commanding knowledge of primate societies, I think is a great person to talk to about that. And my second reason is that I'm just about to embark on a conversation with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So I've been thinking about Buddhism and its Four Noble Truths, which the first of which is that life is all about suffering, and that suffering is caused by various sorts of desires and craving. And so I think that there's very strong evolutionary reasons for that. So that's the topic. And maybe you'd just like to comment on that before we get into specifics on what I've just said up to now.
Well, I think that what we know about the behavior of other animals tells us that both competition and cooperation play an important role. And in some ways, cooperation depends on the existence of competition. And that seems to come out all over the place. And so I think that the view, the sort of more balanced view is under what circumstances does cooperation evolve?
Yes, cooperation is a form of competition, less at the level of some grouping. It might be just a pair, or it could be a larger unit. And I think it's important in human life and in animal life to distinguish between forms of competition and unhealthy, disruptive forms of competition. And if we could focus on the unhealthy forms, things that would be horrifying in human life, things that we would definitely categorize as despotic or evil even. For example, infanticide would be one example, or forms of competition among females that are clearly good for the dominant members, but not at all good for the subordinate members or even the group as a whole. Could you give us some example of some of these forms of competition which we would not ever want to see in human life?
I think that we have very strong moral senses about desirable outcomes in life. So we have strong preferences for outcomes that are fair. We have strong preferences for outcomes in which resources are distributed equally. But those moral sentiments are not very common in nature. It's not that they never exist. It's that the circumstances which promote them seem pretty unusual. And so I think actually cooperatively breeding animals provide a super example of how complex the relationship between competition and cooperation really is. So in cooperatively breeding primates, of which there are a few, and in cooperatively breeding mammals in general, there is a social organization, a mating system in which there's one breeding pair and other group members help the breeding pair rear their young. And one of the benefits of this, or one of the consequences of this breeding system, is that females are able to produce offspring in larger litters and at more frequent intervals. So there's a big positive impact on fertility. But there are big conflicts of interest between individuals over things like who is it that actually gets to be the breeding pair, who gets to be the breeding female. And so cooperation has presumably evolved because although the benefits to individuals in the system may vary, overall, there are benefits that outweigh the cost to the non-breeding individuals. And in almost all of the mammalian cooperative breeders are based on kinship, so that the members of groups are closely related. So the disadvantages of giving up breeding opportunities are presumably outweighed by the benefits of investing in very closely related offspring.
So genetic relatedness, key factor in all of these societies. You're saying, although we'll get to friendship, there's also among unrelated individuals, but you're saying that kinship is huge here in primate.
Kinship is huge in promoting cooperation in the face of what are obvious conflicts of interest between individuals. In the animals that I study, there is, again, both competition and cooperation. So I mostly study animals like baboons, which live in big groups that contain multiple males and multiple females. And males leave their groups at sexual maturity and go off and join new groups, but the females stay home. And so they grow up in the groups in which they're born, and they're surrounded by other females, some of whom are relatives and others that are unrelated to them. And they organize themselves into these matrilineal units so that females interact closely with their daughters and sisters, and their dominance hierarchies reflect their kinship relationships. And the dominance hierarchies are about establishing priority of access to resources. So resources are limited, females will compete over them, and females' access to those resources will influence their ability to reproduce.
And one point to make here is that so often in human life, there's a tendency to think that somehow women are intrinsically more nurturing and cooperative than men. But what we know from primates, and this was a point that was first made by Sarah Blafford-Hrdy, is, well, not so much, because there's intense competition among females, or at least can be in situations such as these. That's more or less still the case, right? I mean, that's still a thing we can say about societies. Female competition is very intense, or often very intense.
It can be, but again, the best examples of cooperation in primates involve females who cooperate with one another in various contexts. And the response to competitive pressures acting on individuals is often to form cooperative relationships that help individuals compete effectively. So the thing that I always run into in thinking about female primates is how closely competition and cooperation are linked.
In this case, the cooperation is female lineages, and the competition is competition among lineages. Is that right? Within a troop. So we see the troop subdivided into subgroups. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, to some extent, although, I think there's competition at all levels. There's competition between matrilines. And there's also competition within matrilines. So when we look at our data, and almost anybody looks at data on monkeys, macaques, baboons, vervets, we see a lot of aggression among sisters.
Uh-huh.
So they're competing with one another, although they would also cooperate with one another against outsiders.
Right.
But what's really lovely in our data is that mothers and daughters have extremely peaceful relationships. So there's variation even within families in the structure of cooperation and competition.
And so that's great. Two of the primate species that are going to be actually present at Dharamsala, where I'm going to meet with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, are Hanuman langurs, just macaques. Can you tell some stories about them? Both cooperation stories and conflict stories?
Rhesus are a lot like baboons in that they have these big matrilineal units and they have these matrilineal dominance hierarchies so that mothers and daughters and sisters occupy adjacent rank positions. So they're, to the first approximation, very similar to the baboons that I work with. Langurs, on the other hand, have been really important in understanding the evolution of reproductive strategies because they were the first species in which what we now call sexually selected infanticide was observed. And this goes back to work that Sarah Hurdy did in the 70s. So she studied langurs in India, and she noticed that infants often disappeared in the aftermath of takeovers in one male groups. So rival males would challenge and displace a male from his one male group. And in the aftermath of these events, infants disappeared. And her observations were consistent with observations that some other people had made, but it was Sarah who put two and two together. And the way she put it together was that what might be going on, she thought, was that when males were ousted from their groups and other males took over, they systematically killed infants that had been sired by the previous leader male. And the purpose of the infanticide was that it shortened the time they'd have to wait until the mothers of those infants were ovulating and able to conceive again. So instead of letting the kids grow up, get weaned, and have their mothers begin cycling again, they short-circuited that process by killing the infants. They killed the infants, mothers come back into estrus, males mate, the new leader male mates with the females, and then is able to increase his own reproductive success at the expense of other males.
This was hugely controversial at the time, is that right?
It was hugely controversial, and it was controversial for two reasons, one good reason and one bad reason. The good reason was that it was all based on circumstantial evidence. It seemed like a lot of kids were disappearing, but nobody actually ever seen a male actually kill an infant. And there weren't very many observations. It wasn't a very robust body of data. It was almost anecdotal. And that was a good reason to be skeptical.
Sure.
The time it was introduced, there wasn't that much evidence. And it was possible that something else had happened to those kids. It's true that the takeovers are quite chaotic and maybe kids just got in the way. The bad reason for the controversy was what we've come to think of as the naturalistic fallacy, that many people simply objected to the idea that infanticide might be an evolved male reproductive strategy because they worried that if it were true for langurs, it would somehow be okay. That because it was something that was a natural product of evolution, somehow that made it okay. And if it was okay for langurs, then maybe it was okay for us. And they didn't like that idea. So the tendency to conflate is and ought, the tendency to think that what natural selection might have produced, or that what we see in nature is somehow automatically morally okay, caused a lot of people to reject Sarah's ideas.
For professional biologists, in addition to just other folks, because that's very, very deeply ingrained. Again, some kind of root assumption that evolution should make everything nice. And if there's something that's not nice in nature, then it's pathological. It's not actually a product of evolution. So that gets us down to the root kind of assumption that evolution should make everything nice. And that's the import of Darwin's theory, was that's not necessarily the case. Not necessarily the case. Niceness can evolve. It's not as if nothing is nice in nature, but special conditions are required. I think that's the main message that I'm trying to make with this conversation.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, as it turns out, infanticide occurs in a really large number of species. There is no reasonable argument against the hypothesis. It's been extremely well documented, and Sarah turned out to be right in pretty much all the details.
Species in which infanticide is one of the most major causes of infant mortality, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right?
Yep. I mean, I studied a group of baboons, of chacma baboons, in which infanticide is the major cause of mortality for kids. And of course, from an evolutionary perspective, what turns out to be super interesting is, given this enormous selective pressure acting, how do animals respond to it? And one of the ways baboons have responded to it is by evolving counter adaptations. So baboon females form these very close relationships to males when they're nursing their infants. And these relationships with males, who are usually the fathers of their infants, probably provide them and their infants with protection against potentially infanticidal males. So again, this competitive pressure has then created selection favoring what's a very cooperative relationship between males and females.
Great. And let's talk a little more about friendship. Cooperation among individuals that are not genetically related. You've given one example, females with males to protect their offspring, typically the fathers. That gets us back to parental care. But how about some examples of cooperation among relatives that tell similar stories?
So in nature, another mechanism for promoting cooperation is based on reciprocity, on turn-taking. And there's lots of it depends on who you talk to, but there's certainly some evidence for reciprocity in other species besides humans. So in many animals, if you look at something like grooming interactions, grooming is great because it's pretty common and it's a kind of turn-taking. It's a directed behavior.
Right.
I groom you, then you can groom me. And in many species, we see positive correlations between how much each individual grooms its partner and its partner grooms it. And so we see relationships among unrelated individuals in which levels of cooperation are reasonably well balanced. And we think this might be the product of or examples of these types of reciprocal relationships. But when we use the word friendship, I'm very careful about using the word friendship because I think that word has very special meaning for humans, and for thinking about human relationships that I don't know apply in other species.
Okay. What's that difference? What is it about human friendships that we might not see in non-human primates?
Well, reciprocal relationships, or reciprocity was once described as reciprocal altruism, and people began to think that reciprocal altruism might not be the best descriptor for those relationships, because if I groom you because you'll groom me, That's a really pretty self-oriented form of behavior. So I'm not really interested in how much you get groomed. I'm only interested in grooming you because then you'll groom me. It's all about me.
Well, we're not inferring. I mean, we're not inferring intentions, are we? That's the one. That would be one of the hardest things to study in non-human primates. We don't really know how they think about it. All we know is they're doing at the behavioral level.
This is a really important point and a really big problem for thinking about the psychology underlying behavior in nature. I was really interested in this, and I have actually tried to make some progress in thinking about how other animals think about their partners. And I've done that by bringing animals into the lab and providing them with behavioral choices that might allow us to figure out how they feel about their partners. So we borrowed the techniques used in behavioral economics and set up experiments in which chimpanzees in the lab were given choices between two different outcomes. Okay, and one outcome for the chimps would deliver a reward to themselves and the same kind of reward, identical reward to their partner, to another chimp. So they had that choice. And then the other choice was to choose an outcome that would provide a reward for themselves and nothing for their partner.
Yeah, so this is a well-established paradigm in human research that you were able to do with chimps.
So we simplified the kinds of experiments you do with people so that we could run it with chimps. And when we ran that experiment, what we found was that chimps were not particularly likely to choose the option that benefited both themselves and their partner. They chose at random. And what that says to us is that chimps are not particularly motivated to provide benefits to others. They're not particularly motivated by the impact of their behavior on others. So they don't seem to have a preference for outcomes that benefit others.
And it's been said that they don't even understand what it means to point. That's a famous result. Has that result stood at the test of time? That they don't even. I mean, that's like a natural counterpart of that experiment. That in nature, if there's something which would benefit another individual, and it's almost costless to point it out, they do that so seldom that they don't even get the concept.
Yeah, that's a observation. Whether or not you need pointing to do that, but certainly there's not a huge amount of evidence of going out of your way to help others. But there is interestingly, chimps are one of the only species in which food sharing is common. So chimps share meat. Right. And that has been raised as evidence that chimps are perhaps quite cooperative and altruistic. But again, the observational evidence from the food sharing has been hard to interpret, which is part of the justification for bringing them into the lab.
So does this put you at odds with Frans de Waal, who writes, of course, beautifully about sort of the roots of empathy and sympathy being found in non-human species, including chimps?
Yep.
Yeah, you've heard it, podcast universe. Disagreement among the experts.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we disagree pretty profoundly about the issue.
Well, I mean, I've recently read Richard Wrangham's Goodness Paradox, in which he, I think, would be more in tune with what you're saying, that you just don't see a lot of cooperation or, empathetic or behavior in our closest relatives, more so the bonobos. Let's compare the chimps with bonobos for a few minutes, and then we'll move on to humans.
Well, bonobos also fail what we call the prosocial test.
Hey, that's interesting. That's fascinating. And the same with no difference between chimps and bonobos that way?
No.
That is so interesting. Well, that was short. Now we can move right on to humans. So, well, now, I mean, with bonobos, we can say that there are this interesting phenomenon of females grouping up to suppress male domination, right? That part is true, right?
Yep.
So there we have a form of cooperation. It's and presumably infanticide is not as common for that reason in bonobos. Is that true?
Well, infanticide in chimps seems to be linked to female fertility issues. Infanticide in chimps is pretty complicated. So, and not sort of part of the sort of sexually selected infanticide.
But not a lot of male infanticide, more infanticide by females against others.
Males sometimes kill infants, but it seems mainly about aggression toward females, which is meant to push them away and create more land for females within their communities.
Yeah, so I mean that actually
female competition that involves infanticide.
There you have a level of selection, you might say, between communities. So patrolling their edges of their territory, and when they find either males or females from other communities, killing them or harassing them or terrorizing them, and therefore expanding their territory, which is something which is done at least some cost, not necessarily a high cost, but benefits the whole community, not themselves over any kind of short term, only a long-term expansion. I'm written a whole essay on this, saying that this is a form of community-level selection, literally selection among communities. And I think that I wonder, does that exist also in some of the other species that you've studied more closely, like baboons? You've said, I mean, they live in very large groups, and then there's all this stuff taking place within those groups. But is there also a level of competition and selection that's taking place with some of these large troops expanding and crowding out other groups?
There is. I mean, intergroup conflict and intergroup competition happens in many species of primates, some of which defend discrete territories, some of which have lots of overlap between their ranges, but still have competitive relationships. The dynamics of those interactions are not that well studied, and the processes that are involved are not that well understood. So, but what powers this group level behavior and is really interesting. Chimps, the thing that's really fascinating about the chimps is that we know that these males that participate in these patrolling activities are often not very closely related at all. And right. One of the things that's been really interesting from the chimp research is that you get this kind of collective action without kinship as a primary mechanism.
Right.
The big question is what and it's clear that the more males there are that are out on these patrols, the safer they all are and the more successful they'll be. But how they avoid the sort of collective action failures is not clear. It's a wonderful problem in terms of trying to figure it out.
Yeah, it is. And that for me, that has multi-level selection written all over it, but I'm not going to go there, at least not explicitly. I want to actually make another point, which is that what you expect is that, and this balance between competition and cooperation, disruptive forms versus constructive forms of competition, is really, you should expect to see a mosaic with different outcomes on a trait-by-trait basis. And one kind of cooperation has to do with decision-making, such as where to forage on any particular day. And it was Hans Kummer, as you know, that described a baboon troop as one where in the beginning of the day they'll make all these intention movements and the different subgroups, and then that kind of gets factored in, and then they all go someplace. And I don't know how I can ask you how much more research has been on that, but I do know in other species, such as African buffalo, there really is what is essentially a process of voting that leads to collective decisions. Ian Cousin is well known for that kind of work, even in things like fish schools and bird flocks, which where the members of the group might not even know each other, but still they've evolved in a way that enables them to make smart collective decisions. So, what do you have to say about that? A possible context for cooperation among individuals who, in other contexts, would be competing with each other.
That's interesting. I haven't thought so much about it as a competition cooperation question as a coordination question.
Right.
And for primates, there's this trade-off. So being with the group is super important because it protects you from predators. Okay, so let's say you're a female baboon with a young infant. It's not really, as I used to say in my daughter's preschool, it is not a choice to go off by yourself.
Right. It could be totally horrible within the group, but still better than if you're going to go off by yourself.
Right. So you've got to coordinate. And there are all these conflicts of interest because, individuals may want to stay and groom. They may want to feed. They may, have different needs at any particular moment, but they also need to stay together. And so this process of how they work this all out has been fascinating for a long time. So when you're out with a baboon group in the morning, they come down out of their trees, they groom for a while, they hang out for a while, and then they decide to go somewhere. And you're standing there wondering where you're going to go, and you have no idea where you're going to go. And somehow they figure it out and they go there. But there's obviously this kind of like amoeba-like process where they some of them go off for a little while, then they come back, then others go off for a little while, and then they come back. But it's been impossible to get a handle on this. But they've started using, Meg Crowfoot has done a lot of work using remote sensing with primate groups. And she's recently put remote sensors on almost all the individuals in a group of baboons, and she can see this playing out in real time.
Oh boy, that would be like, technology there could really nail down what Kummer only kind of could speculate about.
Absolutely. That's absolutely right. And, it's early days. Meg had, 30 baboons transmitting for about 21 days. So obviously we'll need more data.
Right.
But she can really look at the sort of voting and quorum sensing kind of processes because she can see at a really microscopic level what everybody's doing. It's going to be great.
Yeah, and I think when we think of that as a form of cooperation, I think it certainly is. I don't think there's much difference between cooperation and coordination, but what you can say about it is it's a form of cooperation in which the benefit-cost ratios are extremely favorable for cooperation because you're working towards a joint outcome that everyone's going to benefit. Cost of doing it, basically coordinating in the right way rather than the wrong way, is calorically or risk in every way is extremely low. So it's a form of, I think of it as a form of extremely low cost, verging on no cost cooperation.
It'll be interesting to see how this all plays out. I mean, one model is the group goes wherever the alpha male wants to go, in which case, but that's going to be a really hard one to unpack, to kind of figure out what the costs are of different decision outcomes.
Right.
If I want to go right and you want to go left, does it, is there a cost to me for going left instead of right? Get that.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's finish up with humans. One of the titles of your articles, which I love, is Moral Man, Amoral Monkey.
Yeah.
The Roots of Human Moral Sentiments. So You hinted at the beginning that human moral sentiments have something to do with what makes us so different from other primate species. Please elaborate on that.
Well, I think humans have a whole suite of characteristics that are qualitatively different than the characteristics of our closest living relatives. So I think that there's a bunch of things in humans that are derived. It doesn't mean that they're unique, but it means that they didn't come from the most recent common ancestor that we share with chimpanzees. So, for example, I think that humans actually care about the welfare of other people, that they really are, in many situations, they are happy when others are better off. That doesn't mean that we don't have enemies. It doesn't mean that we have goodwill toward all humankind. But it means that there are many situations in which we will actually give up resources in order to make others better off.
Within our moral circle, typically. Sometimes
within our moral circle.
And sometimes sometimes to strangers and very specific contexts. But consider.
Our moral circle is culturally set.
Yes.
So in some cases, the moral circle is the family.
Yep.
In some cases, the moral circle is the ethnic group.
Yep.
One of the things that is remarkable about humans is the flexibility of establishing the boundaries of the moral circle.
Yep. So what's your story as to how we evolved in that direction? Now I'm a big fan of Christopher Bohm and his reverse dominance hypothesis. So we've talked about Frans de Waal as someone. Chris Bohm is another person. And but what's your own views on how it is that we became this ultra-social species?
I think, not surprisingly, that the cultural group selection ideas have a lot to recommend them, that they provide a pretty compelling possibility for how group level cooperation evolved. And group level cooperation then favored the evolution of a psychology that was strongly influenced by local cultural norms. And in many circumstances, those cultural norms, those moral norms favor cooperative sentiments and favor pro-social sentiments that underlie cooperative behavior.
Right.
So I guess that's my general orientation. I began as a very strong sociobiologist who thought humans were just another primate and you needed nothing to explain human behavior. But over the years, I've come to think that not just we're extraordinary in terms of social learning, but we're just weirdly nice.
Right. Yeah, and although Richard Wrangham's goodness paradox, I think, there's all sorts of things to be said about self-domestication, the difference between reactive aggression and proactive regression, that yes, we're very nice, but on the other hand, we can commit horrific acts without even raising an eyebrow in the same way that a cat kills a mouse without a bit of aggression, and so on and so forth. So there again is your combination of competition and cooperation. It goes without saying that cooperation in humans, was typically at a small scale, did not extend beyond the group or at most the tribe. But thanks to our flexibility, the moral circle has expanded tremendously and could expand still further. And so the concept of universal morality, even if it never existed in the past, is still something that could exist in the future, because that's how good we are at defining our groups and expanding our moral circles. Could happen. Has not happened yet, but could. So I think that is, I see you nodding. So
I agree. I think that the flexibility of defining the moral circle is a really important feature of humans. And I think we've seen how that works. I mean, when there was the tidal wave in Thailand,
Right.
people sent tons of money to Thailand, right? Somehow that was within our moral circle of concern.
Yeah.
And we define who we feel positively about. It doesn't mean, I think there is no easy path to world peace, right? Knowing that we can expand our moral circle doesn't tell us that we will, but it means that we're able to extend our concern to people that we don't have direct contact with, that we don't have immediate kinship to. And that's, I think, a very important message.
I think we can go a little bit further and say this. I think we can say that what causes morality to work at a small scale is exactly what's needed at a large scale. And therefore, the challenge is how to scale up. So what that means is, first of all, we need to have norms. And at a global scale, that means we need a whole earth ethic. But those norms have to be policed, or more generally, rewarded, so that if you abide by those norms, then things go well by you. And if you don't, then there's ways to sanction those that don't. That's what makes it work at a small scale. And it's what's needed at a large scale. So the challenge is then basically how to do that scaling up. Is that something that the way you would think about it?
The anthropologist in me recognizes that social norms vary quite a bit across cultures. So the proposal to scale up a particular set of moral norms rather than another set of moral norms is the problem.
Yes, indeed.
Worldviews have different, there's a bunch of worldviews out there. And, we like ours better, but there are others. And so the competition among worldviews is something we'll have to cope with.
So that means the scaling up is tremendously difficult, but possible, and has in the past, at least at not the worldwide scale yet, but at the scale of hundreds of millions and billions of people. We've covered so much, Joan, and I think that we have, by my lights, we've done a good job of showing that evolution does not make everything nice, and that niceness can evolve, but only when special conditions are met. That's true in genetic evolution, and it's true in cultural evolution, and it provides some guideposts, I think, for how we can go about exercising our moral sense and making the world a nicer place.
Right.
Okay. All right. Well,
fight the good fight.
There you go. All right. Well, thank you so much for spending time with me, Joan, and I look forward to making this, sharing it widely. Thanks for listening to This View of Life. If you like this podcast, you can subscribe in iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you find your favorite podcasts. Please consider rating it on iTunes and leaving a review to help others find the show. This View of Life is produced by the Evolution Institute, a nonprofit think tank whose mission is to provide science-based solutions for today's most pressing social issues in order to improve the quality of life. Learn more at evolution-institute.org. And if this view of life is important to you, then type TVOL 1000, TVOL 1000, to see how you can join the Darwinian Revolution.